Thanks, Mike. Welcome, Bridget and Kristen. Dr. Bridgett von Holt is an evolutionary biologist who specializes in genomic analysis of North American canines. Bridget joined the faculty in Princeton University's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in 2013 and is currently an associate professor. She champions the value of mixed genetic ancestry for endangered species conservation. Her research focuses on evolutionary genomics of admixed canine species across hybrid zones, with her researching having significant conservation applications for endangered species like the red wolf. Bridget is the founder and director of the North American Canine Ancestry Project, as well as co-founder and lead geneticist for the Gulf Coast Canine Project. Now, Dr. Kirstin Brzeski is an assistant professor at Michigan Technological University and a wildlife biologist interested in research at the intersection of applied conservation and evolutionary theory. Her work utilizes a wide range of tools, including genomic sequencing, epigenetic sequencing, camera traps, and a multitude of field-based techniques. And that's easy for you all to say. Kristin's past research has focused on wild canid genetics, and she remains a contributor to the Canine Ancestry Project and director of the Gulf Coast Canine Project. Kirstin integrates her research into teaching during her mammalogy and conservation genetic courses at MTU. Guys, take it away. You know a heck of a lot more of these words than I do.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. So I'm going to kick off our joint presentation tonight. I really had fun listening to the conversations before we all jumped on and got this started, hearing people's experiences, hearing us talk previously about some of the work. Some of you may recognize my background. This is a picture from one of our favorite ghost wolf sighting spots on Galveston Island. And I will go ahead and share my screen and get this started. Okay, great. So we're here to talk about our work with the ghost wolves along the Louisiana-Texas Gulf Coast. And this really initiated through the Gulf Coast Canine Project, and that Bridget and I are here to talk with you about. So my goal for today's portion of the presentation is to give an overview of what the project is, who we are, why we're doing it, where we're doing it, and what we're trying to do. And then I'll lead into some of our important contributions and some of the next kind of steps that we're interested in exploring with our research and our community engagement. So this is us. The Gulf Coast Canine Project team really came together through some of the initial discoveries that I'm going to introduce to you all or remind you about if you've seen previous presentations. And it's a team of friends, colleagues, and scientists that are passionate about canine evolution, conservation, and ecology. So I'm Dr. Kirstin Brzeski. I'm at Michigan Tech. I'm a wildlife geneticist, as that wonderful bio that was read introduced. You're all about to meet Dr. Bridgett von Holt at Princeton University, an evolution biologist. And then our third partner in all of this work is Dr. Joey Hinton, who is an ecologist at Wolf Conservation Center. So we really span a diversity of expertise, and we all bring to the table a different piece of the puzzle to try to really be comprehensive in our research and conservation efforts, all coming from slightly different educational focuses and backgrounds. So, in addition to us, we have really attempted to build a coalition and network of collaborators, citizen scientists, foundations, landowners, whoever will listen to us talk to participate or be involved or and supportive of the work we do. And so this includes some really amazing private landowners in Louisiana that we work really closely with on this research, as well as our partners in Texas, such as Josh Henderson with the Galveston Humane Society, as well as a whole diversity of folks in that area and a diversity of other academic support and team members as well. And, I would while we really work to build and grow, the point of contact kind of remain us three still as the leading kind of researchers involved in this work. But it's through these types of engagements that, I mean, I personally get very, very excited to be able to hear people's interests, hear people's stories, and you know, the many private citizens that are interested and support these interesting Gulf Coast ghost wolves. So I kind of want to give this overview of our project history and development. So that's who we are, but why are we here and how did we get here? And it really all started with this effort to our first sort of scientific inquiry of rediscovering red wolf ancestor in 2018. But before I dive into that, I want to give the context and history of the red wolf so that we can all kind of be situated to understand why rediscovering red wolf genetics was such an important and pivotal component of understanding these canines in this region. So historically, the red wolf was the wolf endemic, meaning it only occurred in the United States along the southeastern coast of the United States. So here in this image, you can see the darker gray is representative approximately of the potential historic range of the red wolf. But due to a combination of factors of habitat loss, persecution, like federally funded bounties, combined with things like disease, really led the species to become isolated and have a severe population declines, where by the 1970s, they were believed to be only persisting in this remnant population here in black in Louisiana and Texas. And this led the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list the red wolf as part of the first cohort of endangered species in 1973, and then initiate a pretty novel and you know, bold idea at that time of attempting to remove any remnant red wolves from the wild to establish a captive breeding program for potential future reintroductions and saving the species, because they felt that they were not recoverable in the wild. So there was a large trapping effort through the 70s up to the 80s, after which red wolves were declared extinct in the region and only persisting in a captive breeding program. But through this effort of developing this captive breeding program, only 14 individuals actually became the genetic founders of all contemporary red wolves. So going from what once was this expansive species, then to this isolated population, ultimately only down to the 14 individuals that bred and became extant red wolves, or the red wolf as we know it today. It's pretty phenomenal if you think about it. And, you know, this leads to the questions and concerns associated with inbreeding in this population and the species today, as well as, you know, trying to understand maybe what was left on the landscape, given so few actually made it into captivity. But despite that, they actually bred well in captivity and were reintroduced into North Carolina in 1987, which you can see that reintroduced population there in the Albemarle Peninsula of North Carolina. And the red wolves initially, you know, the population grew and thrived, but in the mid 2000s, 2010s, there continued to have some real struggles in that North Carolina population, which led to questions associated with the viability and feasibility of recovering this animal in the wild. And so around this time of real concern about that reintroduced population, a citizen scientist on Galveston Island, Ron Wooten, who some of you may be familiar with, had been sending Bridgett and others these really amazing photos of these unknown animals right in the heart of that range where remnant red wolves and the captive population was pulled from. And you can, you know, see some potential similarities between this animal here laying on the Galveston airport runway, and then here is a captive red wolf, a contemporary captive red wolves, and there are some similarities in how they look. But you can never just, you know, phenotypes and exterior appearance, while suggestive, isn't a definitive answer of, you know, potential red wolf genetics or dog genetics or potential other genetic ancestry assessments. That needs to be done genetically. And so that's what we did. So while I was working as a postdoc in Bridgett's lab, tissue samples from some of these animals that had been hit by cars on Galveston were sent to us, and we assessed the genetic ancestry of these individuals. And lo and behold, they actually retained substantial red wolf ancestry, as well as ghost alleles. So this information, genetic information that was lost in the contemporary red wolf because of that huge bottleneck that they went through to go into that captive breeding population, but is now prevalent and circulating in these animals left on the landscape. And so this was our initial paper and discovery, where you can see this figure here where each bar represents an individual, and the color is essentially the proportion of their genetic information being assigned to a different group, and the Galveston Island animals representing both red wolf here in the orange and coyote there in the blue. Something that I find super exciting about this is this in and of itself was a really important discovery, both to understand what might be left there, but also to understand how could that inform this red wolf population that was really struggling in the wild at that point in time. But then another component of this that was really, I think, just strong science, so really demonstrating science at its best, was that a completely different research team using very different methods than us found similar information in Louisiana at the same time. And so Southwest Louisiana, another research group, found that there was red wolf mitochondrial DNA, unique mitochondrial information left on the landscape, as well as individuals that had some amount of red wolf ancestry. So here you have these two different discoveries at the same time using different methods, independent of each other, completely corroborating this really important discovery of red wolf ancestry. So this really fueled us. We hit the ground running. We wanted to understand what type of red wolf, are there red wolves out there? How much ancestry is persisting? How is it on Galveston Island, and where else is it? And the Fish and Wildlife Service similarly needed to have these answers, because they're, at that point in time, the red wolf itself was struggling as a species to survive in North Carolina. And so we actually were funded through the Fish and Wildlife Service to do some primary trapping efforts. So this was focused at first in Southwest Louisiana, where we live trapped a number of canids to collect genetic material, morphological data, put on GPS collars to track movement and space use, and be able to relocate them if and when it was necessary, and try to combine all of this information to actually be able to assess taxonomy. So looking at genomic information, morphological information, behavioral ecology, to say, what are these animals? Are these red wolves? Are these ghost wolves? And take this information to help move red wolf conservation and just canid conservation and biodiversity efforts forward in the region. And so we are awarded this grant in 2020. However, other things happened in 2020, if folks remember on this call. So there were lots and lots of delays, both because of the global pandemic, but also because there was all sorts of crazy weather in that year as well, with record hurricanes along the coast and a deep freeze in Texas at that time. And that's all to say we were really delayed in that first effort, but we made it happen, and I'm really proud of the work that we did. And we deployed a number of GPS collars. These are these collars you can put on a wild animal, and it takes locations, GPS locations every 4 hours, and so you can really track where an animal moves and how it's using the landscape. And for each animal that we have a collar on, we also had its genetics, and we had its body size and all this other really important information. And so that first year, here we are. This is now over the border from you all in Texas, in Louisiana, Southwest Louisiana. We're on some wildlife refuge. We're on some private land. We were on some oil company land, as well as some refuges over here. And then we did ancestry estimates, finding, pretty high red wolf ancestry persisting in this region. And now we have the ability to pair it with movement data and other information to start kind of understanding pack dynamics and behavioral dynamics of these individuals. We secured additional funding to continue these trapping efforts in 2022. And so we've really been trying to maintain animals with collars on it in Louisiana. So this effort is really a continuing research effort, right? So we're continuing working to assess the genetic ancestry and use that to broadly understand taxonomy. But really, we want to know how much of this ghost ancestry is left, how much, of these ghost wolves are out there. Where where are we finding high red ancestry? Where is it persisting and why? And then again, linking that to the ecology and behavior and morphology. So really, what is the impacts of having higher red wolf genetic ancestry? What is the impact of being a ghost wolf, essentially? And so this is where we're sort of targeting some of our efforts now. And I don't know if folks, again, are maybe familiar with this view. This is looking off at where there's going to be a new Margaritaville development currently in the works. If you go there now, there's a bunch of cranes in this picture, but this is from a few years ago. And can you see the ghost wolves? They're just right there in the field. And so this is a pretty regular occurrence. If you go at some of these spots at sunrise, you'll see some of these amazing animals running around the landscape coming in off the beach in the morning. So now I want to kind of transition and highlight some of the research that we've done on Galveston Island specifically. So a lot of this has been in partnership with Josh Henderson at the Galveston Island Humane Society, and we're combining efforts of non-invasive fecal sampling, putting up cameras, doing camera surveys, using the fecal sampling for diet assessments, as well as some live trapping and GPS collar data as well, which was discussed earlier before we actually jumped into the presentation. So I snagged a couple slides to throw in here to be able to talk about some of that GPS collar data, because it's really fun and interesting to look at. But near and dear to my heart is poop, because it can give you so much amazing information without having to get your hands on an animal. So you can look at some really basic assessments of genetics. You can look at their diet. You can understand where they're feeding. And so we're trying to combine all these different tools and methods to best establish long-term monitoring of this population. So I had a graduate student in 2020 and 2021 collect fecal samples across Galveston Island for some non-invasive genetic work. And through this process, we kind of started to look at this at a more population-wide instead of just a, handful of individuals that we'd either have collars on or get potentially roadkill from. And what we can see here is that red wolf ancestry really persists across the island. Each pie chart here represents an individual, and the color represents the potential ancestry assessments and assignments of individuals. And we can see we have an East Beach pack that has pretty high red wolf ancestry. But across the island, although we don't have a great density of sampling on the west end, because it's just actually really hard to find scat down there, we see that the ancestry is persisting throughout the island. But I think what's even, potentially more important or interesting, because we could have predicted that based on what we would expect of gene flow among these individuals. But what I think is really fun and interesting is now we're starting to get at this idea of different packs and pack dynamics. So looking at relatedness of those individuals to look at family group formation. So now again, each circle and pie chart represents an individual, but the color is related to the assignment of them to a particular group. So how the individuals are most related to. And we are seeing, that there's a family group on the east. This is what we call our East Beach pack, right? There's some individual pack here in Midtown, and then going across the island, we have a Jamaica Beach pack. And again, we need to do a little bit more sampling on that west end to really flush out those individuals a little bit more. We've also identified, this is again work from 2020 to 2021, at least 50 individuals. And I'll say that we had a grad student down there both this past summer, so summer 2023, and then just in January of this year, 3 weeks ago, doing this resurveying and going and collecting as much scat as possible to continue understanding and, kind of teasing apart relationships in individuals, and then adding to it assessments of diet so we have a better understanding of what they're eating, where they're eating, and how they're behaving. So what I'd like to highlight here with this Jamaica Beach pack is that our non-invasive genetics is corroborated by our collar data. So here's an individual that has a GPS collar on it, and each dot again represents a GPS point taken in every 4 hours of this individual's daily activity with the GPS collar around its neck. And it is just right there on Jamaica Beach, right? That is where it goes from the state park over to this green space, state park over to the green space, right? Like it is going back and forth, and avoiding, right, all of this more developed area. And so we know that these animals this is holding a distinct and discrete territory and likely excluding other individuals, other non-pack members from it, which is a very classic, ghost wolf or wolf behavior, as well as probably coyote behavior. So it's a classic kind of canis behavior. Now, while we were, starting to launch up this Zoom and this discussion, there was a reference to a slide that was shown at our recent town hall that we gave on Galveston, where again, now this is an individual ghost wolf that had a GPS collar on it. And instead of being in one isolated area, this individual is moving all over the place, going all the way down to the Port O'Connor, all the way back up Texas City, right? So over 470 days, this individual covered at least 2,095 miles. So this is the same distance as going from San Diego, California to Jacksonville, Florida, if you stretch it out in a straight line distance. And of course, this individual is not walking in a straight line distance. It's walking around, skirting around urban areas, tucking into green spaces. And I don't have the zoomed in look on Galveston Island, but I heard some folks talking about earlier too, how they were surprised when looking at some of these images of where these animals are moving, that they weren't staying in Jamaica Beach, the state park, or they weren't staying in a big green space like East Lagoon or something like that. And it's because most likely there's already established individuals there. There's already established packs that are excluding them and pushing them from those areas. And we can see that with, these red dots, right? This family group that is represented here in the purple is likely excluding this individual that's moving around. And I don't have the genetic information of this individual at hand to place into what family group it might belong to, but we would say it's a transient. It's moving around, it's looking for space, it's looking for somewhere to set up shop at some point and ideally reproduce. But this is really indicative of that transient movement, moving around large spaces, exploring before, coming back to Galveston, which this individual did do. All right, so that's kind of the who, why, where, and what, what we've been doing, who we are, and why we're doing it. I'd like to transition a little bit to some of the important contributions that we've been doing over the last handful of years. And, the first of which is scientific contributions, right? We're researchers, we're academics, we publish peer-reviewed papers, and we, really try to get our science out there. So here's one of the first papers that came from our first season in Louisiana. Reviving ghost alleles, genetically admixed coyotes along the Gulf Coast are critical for saving the endangered red wolf, right? And so this goes into the scientific work, and really proud of this work, and it will be an important contribution and important efforts that we maintain into the future. But I would argue that maybe our largest contribution and most important contributions broadly are how this has captured the imagination of the public. These are these ghost wolves, right? Reviving, you keep these words revived, lost and recovered. And it is a important and uplifting and positive conservation story of the persistence of nature and the persistence of wildlife on a landscape that isn't always friendly to it. And they're still out there doing their thing, right? Being the unique endemic ghost wolf of that region. And so I'm really hopeful and really proud of how our work, I think, has uplifted this message and again, really galvanized the public. And, we're in, international and large publications, public media publications, really promoting this idea of the resilience of these animals and the importance of them. But ultimately, we're still remembering that, endangered red wolf. So how can this work help the red wolf itself? We're called these ghost wolves. We don't necessarily call them red wolves, given that they retain this lost genetic information. But, there's, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the red wolf exists exclusively in safe breeding facilities, and which would be a captive human under human care. And then, now there's about 20 known red wolves in North Carolina. So how can our work help that population? How can that help revive an endangered species? And I think we can do this through several ways. First, Gulf ghost wolves or Gulf Coast canines, they carry an unprecedented amount of unique genetic variation. And we know that the endangered red wolf has gone through extreme inbreeding, and gone through this extreme bottleneck, right? And so here we are identifying and and finding this lost genetic information that can be really used to help increase adaptability and resilience of the native wolf to that region of the United States, to your region of the United States. Additionally, this idea of, well, how do you recover them, right? From a red wolf to a coyote to an admixed individual. And Bridget's gonna go more into some of the understanding of the genetics of these animals. But there's good old fashioned breeding programs could be established, combined with this being a real flagship species and a flagship system to, move the ball forward for conservation in an era of unprecedented biodiversity loss, where we now have new developing biotechnology tools. We have new emerging ways to recover lost genetic lineages from tissue samples. And this could be a really emblematic group that these types of tools could be used for. And so that's something else that we discuss and try to like spread the understanding that we have a unique opportunity to really impact red wolves and the restoration of endemic biodiversity in the region. So, thinking about kind of what's next, and I would say more. Like we're going to keep going. We're really passionate about this work and the work that we do. And, an important component of that is we really want to start to identify the landscapes and habitats that are retaining these ghost wolves, and continue that study of morphology and behavior and the genomes and all of that, because we work in these systems of Southwest Louisiana, which looks very different than Galveston Island, and yet both regions have these distinct animals. So we're gonna keep kind of expanding the data collection as well as the kind of questions that we can ask to get at this idea at a landscape level. And something that's pretty near and dear to my heart and that I'm very excited about is kind of developing this pipeline to work with the communities that, we seem really excited about this work. We always get questions, how can I help? How can I get involved? And we want to establish this pipeline where people can get involved by collecting scat samples and having a framework in which they can actually collect them and send them to us. In the future, not yet. I like to caveat that, please don't send me poop right now. But in the future, we want to have this, and hopefully in the future soon, we will have a way where someone can give us a scat sample and we can assess diet. So this is an example pie graph where each different section represents a different potential diet item from a fecal sample. And we can get individual genotypes and those ancestry estimates as well, and use that to really sample intensely across the landscape. So engaging academic partners and local participants to participate in the scientific process and ideally this kind of conservation process as well. And with that, we're going to hold, I think, questions off till the end, except things that we can answer in the chat. But I just say, if you have other questions or interests, please definitely visit our website, gulfcoastcanineproject.org. We have some really fun swags. We got beautiful shirts on the website, as well as a donate button that is, 100% goes to our research. There's no overhead associated with that. And we just reinvest that back into the work that we do. And so if you're, at all interested in donating or wearing a cool Gulf Coast Canine shirt, please visit our website. And thank you so much for your time and listening to me. And I will hand it over to the extremely capable hands of Dr. Von Holt.
Oh, thank you, Kirstin. That was wonderful. How's that look? Can you see my slides? Yes.
That's good.
Okay, good. Thank you. As you can tell, I love this photo. Kirstin's already showed it. I really love the story behind how some resident was extremely curious and persisted in reaching out to researchers. And when I got the email from Ron Wooten, everything else is history. So the story starts with this picture, and I received this among many emails of pictures of dogs and people who have trail cams up in their yards or on their property. And a lot of the time, as Kirstin was saying, it's quite difficult to make any sort of judgment call as to the uniqueness of this animal. And I had to go against my normal suggestions to people, which is, oh, you got to give me a lot more data in order for me to have an informed opinion. But when I saw this picture in my inbox, I told Ron, we need to learn more. This animal looks very interesting, and it's very curious to me how and why it looks this interesting. So all of the credit goes to Ron Wooten, who's been watching these animals on Galveston for quite a long time. And he has such wonderful stories, everything he's learning about them. The photos and videos that he shares with us give us really amazing insights into the lives of these animals. Just like a lot of the questions already in comments have said, well, where are these animals? Why are they not always in the state park? Or why are they always on this corridor of a road or a beach? Learning how they're using that landscape is quite important, but we suspect that the reasons these animals are doing certain things probably lies in some effort or another in what their DNA is telling us. So I zoom in on this little guy because I fell in love with this picture from the start, and knowing that this was going to be the start of a challenge. And again, anything with red wolves is quite difficult because of all the Endangered Species Act protection and regulations, and also battling the sense that if this is a coyote carrying something else, there's usually a negative connotation for anything that has mixed ancestry when it comes to wildlife species and especially endangered species. So my heart goes out to this animal. And I have always wanted to do what I can to learn everything about it. The reason it's so unique is thinking about the 3 types of canines it can be in this part of the country, in Galveston and Texas. It's not technically going to be a gray wolf. We know that red wolves had been declared extinct in the wild in 1980. So that usually leaves us all with the last category of, well, it's got to be a coyote. And after studying, and I continue to study coyotes across the continent, we know that they're very diverse. So it's very possible that this could just be a coyote. Maybe it's a dog hybrid that gives it some unique features. So when Ron sent the couple samples to us in the lab, we wanted to check all of those possible options. And as Kirstin already told you, these animals came back with a substantial amount of red wolf genetics. But the concern I have in trying to explain to people is, how in the world could this coyote taking a nap on an airport runway in Galveston, why does it have red wolf DNA in it? If this came across my desk, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago, like, the red wolf has been gone for 40 something years at that time. So how does his DNA get there? And that's what I'm trying to sort of structure this story for you today. In addition to studying these Galveston ghost wolves, I just have a research program where I love looking at the evolutionary genetic history of canids in North America. And coyotes are one of those species that lives everywhere, yet we actually know very little about it. People have studied pockets of coyotes out west and in the Northeast, and we have some really great stories for these little regions. But I've really set out to try to understand a continent-wide population history. And as I have the perspective across several states, most of the states in the lower 48, I can start asking these questions about genetic ancestry and partition all of the DNA from any particular individual into 3 different categories. I want to know how much any particular animal carries DNA that looks to be a coyote ancestry coming from red wolf genetic ancestry or gray wolves. Again, some of that depends on the region the geographic region I'm looking at, but for the most part, those are the three options that I would like to categorize. On the left-hand side, the pie charts there give us just really broad averages for each of those states that have a pie chart. And I'm only showing you a subset of the states. The red slice shows us on average where we detect red wolf genetic ancestry. And you can see that there's this interesting pattern. I put the little pink star to denote where Galveston is in our original findings from Ron Wooten. And we have this high concentration that seems to really be focused in Texas, Louisiana, sometimes out a little further east, and dwindles as you move north and west in particular. We've been then focusing on more county level or parish level genetic data, and that's what's on the right-hand side of this slide. But those pie charts are now representing averages for the counties that I happen to have samples from at the time that this slide was made. And of course, we're missing so much geographic area, but we can see that there's now even more of a fine geographic pattern here. Somewhere in central Texas, we have this swap from having predominantly red wolf ancestry in the canids. And as you move westward, they actually turn more and more into the genetic signatures of coyote. So this hot spot is still in the eastern part of Texas and Louisiana. Pretty much no matter where you get a sample from, there's always a high amount of red wolf DNA floating around. And I wanted to explain how some of this ancestry looks. So just bear with me if this is already old news to you. But we throw out a lot of terms when we talk about these animals. And I wanted to be clear on what the scientific definitions are. I've been talking about ancestry. I've probably maybe used the word hybrid, hopefully not, because I don't really like using that. And then the word admixture. So in the world of particularly canines, it's really easy to imagine that when we think of dogs, you can cross a different breed, two different breeds together, and you come up with this nice designer dog, anything that's a doodle, essentially. And that mixing of one breed with another, producing that first generation of puppies, that is what the hybrid definition refers to. That offspring that is the product of two different types that have reproduced. It doesn't have to be two different species. It just is two entities that you have very discrete abilities to put them in different categories. We like to only talk about species hybridizing, but again, it can happen at various levels. So that is just a single first generation. Sometimes if you know exactly how that breeding is, and I'll show you some graphics here in a moment, then you can use the word hybrid, but typically I avoid that word altogether because it doesn't reflect the complex nature that we are talking about. So admixture is really at the heart of why this ghost genetic and red wolf genetic variation exists in the coyotes. Admixture is the result of a hybridization event and lots of other subsequent reproductive events. And it's the product of this genetic exchange. So admixture really is describing that in a single animal or a single organism, there can be multiple genetic ancestries that come together. So now for these little chromosome graphs on the bottom, this is my little cartoon of what genomes look like. We are diploid, so each of us have two copies of our genome, one we get from mom, one we get from dad. In the case here, I've got the two colors. Red indicates one distinct group, and the red pair of chromosomes is another distinct group. It could be two different species, it could be two different breeds of dogs, but when you have mating between those two different colors of chromosomes, the offspring inherits one from each parent. So this is where we can easily say you have 50% genetic ancestry to the blue chromosome type and 50% genetic ancestry to the red. This is what we call an F1 hybrid. We know exactly how it was produced. Now, it becomes far more complicated the moment we start going through subsequent generations of breeding, there is an F2 generation. And an F2 generation is the second generation that's explicitly made by having two F1 individuals reproduce together. And now we take that 50% of ancestry and combine that with meiosis, where our DNA can break and just reshuffle itself to create wonderful genetic variation. But what that does is break up these these chromosomes into ancestry blocks. And that's why we now have these three different examples of sets of chromosomes for an F2. So there's three different F2 genomes here, and they all can inherit something slightly different. But the point is that we're having these chromosomes break up, reshuffle, and join together in new ways. Now, a different type of reproduction between individuals of different ancestries is a bat cross. And this, again, we know exactly how this animal or this organism has been produced. We take an F1 individual and it then is mated to one of the parental genomes. In this case, it's crossing with that red genome, and that now influences the outcome of that reproduction. We have much more red chromosomal ancestry than we do blue. And you can imagine that this now can happen in so many complicated ways. If you have a pack of coyotes and even a dog coming into this mix, there's going to be puppies everywhere. And as they grow up and get mates, that mixing of ancestry is going to become really complicated. And that's what I love about this aspect of genetics, is we now see that over subsequent generations and lots of crosses between different animals, we can get these really complex ancestry patterns across a chromosome. And what I like to do is leverage DNA and look at the ancestry across chromosomes. And I get to learn a lot about how long ago that mixing happened and what are the identities of those ancestry bits across a genome. Now we can use this in a more concrete example. So I've got two of my known species here, the identities. So now red is going to represent coyote ancestry and blue will represent gray wolf ancestry. And if I somehow sequence a bunch of samples, these three samples here, and come up with these three genomes with the certain color patterns, I don't get the colors on my screen as I'm looking through DNA. But what I do have are a series of points that I know exactly at this nucleotide and another nucleotide on my string of DNA, I know what the genetic information is. And I can compare that and find out if I have two red colors, then I know that's coyote. If I have two blue colors, that belongs to a wolf. And one of each means I get to start adding up the summation of how many red and blue bits of genetic data I have for each individual. And you can now see that even though I have this global ancestry estimate, two of these examples have exactly the same amount of ancestry, 50-50, but their genomic structure of those ancestry blocks is quite different. And that means that those animals have very different histories of how they came to be admixed or carrying that mixed ancestry. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a tiny bit and try to describe for you how we've identified this ghost part of the ghost wolves. And Kirstin was telling you a bit about that as well. The term ghost genes or ghost DNA was coined probably about 30-something years ago. And it was in reference to thinking about the DNA and the genetic variation that might have been lost over time. One way in which you can lose DNA is when populations are on the decline and they go through what we call as a population bottleneck. And this little graphic on the left depicts a population bottleneck. All of the circles represent genetic diversity, different types of genes. And as the population is traveling down this slide, it gets bottlenecked. Lots of animals are presumably dying, not reproducing, being somehow extirpated from the region. And a handful of animals are the only ones that survive this population contraction. And that's what we see in the middle of this graph, those two orange circles plus that light blue circle. So we can then look back in time and say, out of all of the genetic variation that did exist, those three circles are the only ones that survived this population crash. And then everything, that whole species rests upon the shoulders of those three circles, reproducing enough for the species to bounce back. So that at the bottom of the graph, you see only those two colors, and those represent those two different types of genes that survived that bottleneck. So GHOST refers to the fact that we can go back through like museum specimens and any sort of historic catalog. We know that lots of state and federal biologists took feather samples of species since the early 1900s, if not beforehand. We know bones and other sorts of pelts have been collected. So if we were to go to a museum and start sequencing all of those, we could actually identify what genetic diversity existed in the mid-1800s that no longer exists today. And that's our first definition of GHOST genetic variation. But I'm going to challenge you that there's a second way that we define this. And that is through this reproduction as a way to transfer DNA from one species to somewhere else. We have a really prime example of that in our own genome. Many of us might have done one of those 23andMe genetic ancestry tests, and perhaps have gotten back a result that gives us some percentage, maybe 1.5% of Neanderthal DNA. And that is because at some point in the early history of humans, when there was several other human hominid types of species in existence, that there was some genetic exchange between them. They reproduced with each other. So the cartoon on the left shows us how the arrows go between the three different types of human lineages where genes were exchanged. So the reason we carry some Neanderthal DNA is because at one point, hundreds, if not thousands of generations ago, a prototype of a modern human, an early archaic human, and a Neanderthal had offspring. Now, the DNA from Neanderthal in our genome can also be considered GHOST genetic variation. But because we know where it came from, we can remove that name of GHOST and call it what it is. It's Neanderthal. The graph on the right is more along the lines of what we're thinking about is happening with these ghost wolves and red wolves and coyotes. There are different branches here on our evolutionary tree, and the branch that's labeled G is a species that went extinct. But before it went extinct, it mated with individuals from that branch labeled F, a different species, and thereby passing on some of its DNA. Then the species G went extinct, and the only remaining fragments of that species exist in individuals that belong to species F. We can probably easily imagine that the species G, I'm trying to refer to as red wolves, and that species F will be the coyotes. And they're carrying around the remnant bits of DNA that they acquired when red wolves mated with them generations ago. So we can kind of learn more about this when we look at DNA from animals that we just sampled in the past 3 years. And when I sequence all of its DNA and I put them together with canines that I know their species identity, because that's how we want to label the things we know and find out the things that we don't know, is cluster them together. It's just putting like with like. So if I look at a bit of DNA from a sample that Kirstin picked up in the field of Louisiana, I'll sequence it and then compare it to everything that I do know. So this is just a cluster analysis, and I've highlighted the names of the things that I do know. Everything at the top in those pink shaded symbols, those are all representative red wolf bits of DNA. Then if we go counterclockwise, then I've got a dog there in those orange circles. Then in the lower left, those are all types of wolves mostly gray wolves, and then the purple asterisks are eastern wolves, and the lower right, those are all types of coyotes from across the continent. So when I start looking at these samples from Louisiana and Texas, and I put them in this cluster analysis, we actually see that they have this really unique placement, that on each of my axes, so on axis 1, PC1, the bottom x-axis, we see that if you look to the right-hand side of the graph, that's where we get our red wolves and our coyotes. And as you go to the left-hand side of the graph, you have the dogs and gray wolves. For the y-axis, we can do the same thing, and we see that those ghost canids actually span the difference, or that little gap between coyotes in the lower right and the red wolves in the sort of upper central. And all those red wolves are from the captive facilities. So we're filling in this missing genetic space. And because we didn't know what it was beforehand, I think we get to call it a ghost. Now we can add one more dimension to this, and that's time. We do have some samples of canids that were caught in the 1970s in the government's attempt to try to find as many founders of red wolves as they could to move into and establish the captive breeding population. So not all of these 1970s canids that were caught in the wild, not all of them went on to become founders. Some of them were released, some of them were old and sick or destroyed for whatever reason, but we do have some DNA from them. And here's another cluster analysis that shows where our Texas and Louisiana animals cluster with respect to these older, I don't want to call them older historic because 1970s is not that long ago, but in terms of genetic information, these 1970s animals were pre-extinction, right before the red wolves went extinct. And yet we're finding that these are filling in this middle missing space that we had never known existed before. And I'm going to show this graph again too, just to reiterate that our work in Louisiana, where we have collars on animals and we've been tracking their use of space. This is in the Little Boot of Louisiana, so just across the border. Kirstin's already pointed out, we have 4 prime areas in which we have collars on animals. And when I go through and do the DNA sequencing of all of those collared animals, we find that there's an interesting pattern in where the red wolf ancestry is found. We see directly on the left-hand side, the west part of the Calcasieu Lake, that the average red wolf ancestry is higher than that of what we see east of the lake. And these two areas, the east and the west side of the lake, are not that far from each other. We have upwards of a 70% red wolf animal in the west and just about 50% on the east. I've also put in the black stars here, which indicate the geographic location in which founder red wolves were captured in the 70s that had been moved to the captive breeding program as founders. So there's some temporal and spatial patterning here that really helps us, I think, with the confidence that we are picking up on real red wolf genetics. The other thing I wanted to show you, just because I love these graphs, is that we can go really deep into the genome and I can color each part of the chromosome for you now in terms of its ancestry identity. These graphs might look familiar if, again, you've done a 23andMe ancestry test. This would have been part of the report that you get. We did the same thing for canines. Canines have 38 autosomes plus an X or a Y or one of each or 2 of one kind. And I've laid them out along the X-axis. So chromosome 1 is on the far left. It's the tallest, the longest chromosome, and chromosome 38 is on the far right. There are 2 genomes I'm showing you here. Each of these vertical chromosomes is broken up into blocks based on the genetic ancestry of that block. Anything colored brown is a coyote ancestry block. Anything colored red is red wolf ancestry. And the yellow indicates that it has 1 chromosome of coyote and 1 chromosome of red wolf at that spot. So these two animals are only 30 miles apart of each other, and we know that coyotes can move that far. And yet the one on the left has 69% red wolf genetic ancestry, and the one on the right has the lowest we've found, is 25%. So there's something really interesting happening, and that's part of Kirstin saying we're doing more. There's so much more to do, and we're on it. I also wanted to just show you how that ancestry relates to the size and shape of these ghost wolves. The left-hand side of this slide gives you these box plots for 4 different types of canines. The far left, we have on the y-axis is just the average body mass in kilograms of a coyote. And then the next category is a known hybrid between a red wolf and a coyote. These are typically coming from North Carolina, where we also are helping out with the genetic analyses of those animals. The third category is an actual red wolf, as has been defined and has lived through the captive breeding program. And then that last category, those are the sizes of our ghost wolves. You see that they do overlap with an actual known coyote red wolf hybrid. That really speaks to that admixed nature of our ghost wolves. And the right-hand side gives you that positive correlation that as an animal has higher red wolf genetic ancestry, it's also among the larger body-sized canids. And we know that that size discrepancy between coyotes are much smaller, red wolves are bigger, and these ghost wolves, as they have more red wolf ancestry, they're on the larger end of the body size spectrum. So I'm going to close out with this tiny little cartoon to try to explain how I think this ghost genetic ancestry has persisted in the wild. We have this time component that prior to the 1970s, prior to the extinction of red wolves in the wild, there existed a bunch of these genes, different genetic diversity. This is the population of a Gulf Coast coyote or ancestor to coyotes and red wolves. And as the red wolves were declining and were the focus of the Fish and Wildlife's concern to move them into a captive breeding program, they went out during the 70s, captured a bunch of animals and moved them into captivity. They only then took a subset of the genetic diversity that existed. And now that's what the government uses as our definition, our genetic definition of a red wolf. But yet there's still all of this pre-1970s genetic diversity. It was there. Where did it go? It didn't just disappear. It actually has continued persisting on the landscape. And in fact, some of those bits of DNA is what we're finding in these ghost wolves, that these are now animals carrying unique genetic variation that can't be defined by just looking at the captive red wolf genetics. So I'm going to close off with the conservation concerns. Again, another Ron Wooten photo of these animals. They're just amazing. I love his photography. Kirstin's already mentioned the Margaritaville, and so we don't quite know what's going to happen as their landscape is being transitioned from green space, sort of undisturbed areas, but we know that these animals live and thrive successfully in a highly urbanized area. So they're certainly not just going to roll over and die, but we have no idea really where this displacement is going to happen. What are the implications for the rest of the animals on the island? And we really want to consider these animals, the unique reservoir they are for endangered genetics, and thereby, I think, heightening them to be a higher concern. Kirstin's already also mentioned the New York Times article, and really what I think it speaks to me about is championing the role of admixed genomes, and that we can't just draw these nice little boundaries around a species. Life is far more complex, and this genetic exchange is actually really important, especially when animals have human urbanization and climate change to deal with. this genetic transfer is really a wonderful way to move around new genetic diversity and help with the adaptation process. And finally, we always got to mention how biotech is going to eke its way into this system. We know that there's a lot of opportunities for using DNA information to try to push conservation into this brand new innovative field of gene editing, cloning, or just very specific use of animals that's based on their genetic information. How can we create a breeding program that would really emphasize and magnify, bring back to life all of this ghost genetic variation that's existing in these Galveston animals? So that's all I got. I have another giant slide to thank everybody, very similar to what Kirstin has, but that's where I sit. I'm going to try to look at the question comment box now too.
Hi, this is Mike. I would like for our presenters to discuss some of the questions that came in over chat that you think would be of general interest to the rest of the audience. Most of us were busy trying to absorb your presentation rather than reading along.
No, of course, totally agree.
Sure. I'd be happy to start so Bridgett can catch up too, because I was responding to stuff in the chat. And I think a couple sort of like thematic questions were sort of public perception and attitudes of both the work that we do along the Gulf Coast, but then also in North Carolina, because with the red wolves in North Carolina, there have been, challenges of public perception and, potentially sort of people mismanagement associated with the decline of the red wolf out there and our experiences along the Gulf Coast. And, I wrote in the chat how, was in North Carolina from 2010 to 2015, working with red wolves and kind of witnessing some of the population decline and kind of negative feelings and challenges associated with that program then, although I'd say they've really working really, really hard to turn that around. And that since the start in both Galveston and then also Southwest Louisiana where we work, it's really been just overwhelmingly positive in the sense of people just being interested, people wanting to learn more, not the immediate knee-jerk reaction of, let's get rid of them, let's kill them. It's really been more of like, oh yeah, that's our wolf. That was here. I know about that. My grandpa, trapped them or, hunted them. And it's a little bit more, I think, of local living memory. And it has led to, I feel this is not, this is anecdotal in my like personal perceptions, just a really more engaged and interested feeling towards these animals, not so much a knee jerk, like, let's get rid of them feeling.
Do you want me to pick up a question that I see that I could help talk about?
Sure.
There was a question about how was the time to admixture calculated? And I know Kirstin talked about coalescence models, but I just want to remind you that when I was showing you those cartoon chromosomes and how over different generations, those blocks can change in shape, essentially the length of those blocks. So the simplest idea is that the more recent events of genetic exchange of admixture, the longer the ancestry blocks are. So an F1 has full chromosomes of coyote and red wolf, full length chromosomes. But by the next generation, those chromosomes will be broken up into smaller blocks. So we simply can say that the pattern is the smaller the ancestry block, the longer ago it happened. And we can bring in some mutation rates and some other modeling, but that's generally the process done. So it's just coloring. I color and count. That's all my job is. I color and count again. I recolor and I recount. So you just color chromosomes and look at how long each of the colored fragments are, basically. Questions on collections. Thank you so much. How closely related are the coyotes and red wolves? Yeah, another good question. We have done some evolutionary genomics to try to understand the origin of red wolves as a species. And this is a really hotly debated topic. People have their favorite story as to how the red wolves came to be. When we looked at full genome sequences, the coyote and the red wolf share, I have a slide. Why don't I just try to find a visual, Bridgett? I've got a good visual for that. Can I talk and actually search for slides at the same time? No, I can't. Okay, this slide, let me show you this slide. Share my screen again. This is my quick and dirty slide to show you. Actually, I have another one that's more detailed, but we have estimated from whole genome sequence data that red wolves and coyotes have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor essentially happens about 100,000 years ago. And we tested all sorts of ways in which a red wolf might have speciated into a red wolf. Did it come from a gray wolf? Did it come from an eastern wolf? Did it come from somewhere else? And none of those other hypotheses have support that we could find when we analyze whole genome sequence data. The best supported relative, close relative, is a red wolf and a coyote. So that's what the drawing that you see here. Now, what we also, though, have to account for, and that's what this sort of modeling approach does, is wherever you place these two common ancestors, these two lineages together, so the coyote and the red wolf, we still have genetic differences between them. Just because they share an ancestor doesn't mean that they have identical genetics. There are differences between them. And as we start comparing what's different and what's shared, we actually find that red wolves and coyotes share a lot more DNA with each other than a red wolf shares with any other canine, gray wolf, Mexican wolf, Eastern wolf, whatever. So we're pretty confident that the placement that red wolves and coyotes did actually come from the same ancestor about 100,000 years ago. But there's been a lot of genetic exchange between the two branches. Red wolves give genes to coyotes and vice versa. So that does make this story complex when you're just looking at DNA, but we're pretty confident in that. What we don't know, though, and some of our colleagues are looking at genomes from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and trying to piece together that story, since we know there are lots of different kinds of canids that have existed. And if they all exchange genetics with each other, if they all can reproduce with each other, there's going to be a much more challenging time teasing apart, is it just a geographic version? Is a red wolf just like a coyote that adapted to the Southeast? In fact, coyotes are also far more interesting, but that's for another talk too. So I hope this slide helped a bit.
There was another, I think that helped. I love that slide.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
There's another great question that was asked about, I lost it now in the chat, but the protection, that these are not ESA listed animals, and is there any efforts, or how can they potentially be protected or in some way elevated to some sort of conservation status? Well, here it is. Have you heard of movement by the state of Texas or Galveston to protect them? Would it entail working with ongoing development trends to carve out enough green space for them to survive? Research can't happen quick enough to give land managers enough information to make smart decisions on approving development permits, kind of, et cetera. It's a great question. Right, so they're not an ESA listed species. Under the legal policy of management, they're coyotes. And that means that they are managed as such. I do think that when it comes to research and public awareness, the more people are aware and the more people are interested, the more people won't treat them like a coyote. Not that people should be treating coyotes poorly. I think that there is work that we're really trying to push is some large connected spaces that are protected, both through being National Wildlife Refuge as well as private land where hunting is not allowed, and other more restricted access, so that you are retaining some core population and some core packs that have no human persecution and no hunting. And we are, working really diligently to try to place these into some sort of conservation framework, and what that means based on our understanding of the genomes and the ecology and behavior and the history. And that's hard, and it's an ongoing process. And I can say we are trying to actually move a lot faster than would be typical of, federal policy, but on you're still working at the restraints of state and federal agencies and local agencies and how they manage and conserve wildlife. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Bridgett. I might not have.
I was just thinking maybe like the important role of private land or preserves or sanctuaries or wildlife refuge and state parks and just private land in terms of, you mentioned the oil land that we have access to in Louisiana. So it doesn't always have to be, I'd like to think it doesn't always have to be regulation based, that if there's enough space that's not being developed. And I think that's what's happening a lot of the time here, that not only are these coyotes and ghost wolves really capable of being generalists and living in some pretty diverse areas, they also have really found and leveraged land that's private and just not being converted and not being developed and not having recreational hunting on it.
Mm-hmm.
I put your email up in the chat, Kirstin.
Thank you. I saw that, and you got to my. I was looking up that link, and you beat me to it.
Oh yeah.
I see a comment about Jamaica Beach, and that someone volunteers at the state park, and looking at the Jamaica Beach Facebook posts, people see the coyote and take photos, but the predominant comment regarding coyotes coming into Jamaica Beach are negative. Is that into the state park, like visitors coming into the state park, or people living in Jamaica Beach? I wonder. Just because I think, like, what a great educational opportunity if it's like visitors coming to the state park. Like we really, thinking about local work, want to get more information, signs and things that are more publicly available on Galveston, so people can be made when they're visiting, when tourists come to the island, people getting more information. So say people living in Jamaica Beach, a number have had pets carried off. Yeah, absolutely. You will if you don't keep your pets inside at night. And so I think that's a big part of the work that Josh Henderson does at the Humane Society and Animal Control with their coyote spotter apps and things like that, that responsible pet management, and that's hard. I totally get it. I have little dogs and I'm always very concerned. So I think that there's local efforts to try to like help combat some of those negative images. And I really love at our town hall, Josh Henderson said he hears a lot about people saying, my cat was eaten, my cat was carried off, my cat's gone. And they had, what was it, Bridgett? 500, some crazy high number of cats showing up at the shelter that were clearly pets. And how
19, I think, were reclaimed by their owners. It was some number that just
people were coming into the shelter. So Josh's comment to that was, before you tell me a coyote ate it or a ghost wolf ate it, come to my shelter and look for your cat. So, I mean, of course, these perceptions persist, and I think that there's always going to be that, right? I would say also look at the Galveston Island Canid research page, because that is just overwhelmingly people loving and being positive about them. And so there's always like these two narratives, and hopefully we can come to some intermediary narrative.
There's another question about seeing coyotes and other spaces and if they carry red wolf genes. I'm gonna put some money on if it's a canid that primarily lives on Galveston Island, probably does. It probably does carry those red wolf genes.
Yeah, that was a question earlier that someone asked if they see a canid on Galveston Island.
Can you just assume?
Yeah, and I was like, probably. Of course, there's going to be coyotes running around the region as well, but by and large, that region, like if you see them, there's a good. I would make the assumption that it's like one of these.
Yeah, I think because what we already know about the geography, and the animals living there, it's a safer assumption to make. But if you show up in the middle of Oklahoma, I would not be making those assumptions. What about canids seen on the mainland? Yeah, well, Kirstin's work and also Josh's collar data indicate, at least to me, that if I were to see an animal just across the intercoastal waterway on the mainland, there's high chance. And also, as we've looked at different counties in East Texas, that red wolf genetics goes pretty far north up that eastern Texas border. So I think that I'm not sure that I would again say you run into a coyote and you're going to be able to say, oh, this is a red wolf. But you have a much higher chance in that part of the state of having that red wolf DNA and ghost DNA floating around. If you go to West Texas, you're not going to have that confidence to say, hey, that coyote has something unique in it in terms of ghost alleles. I'm just reading questions here. Right, materials that we could use to share this information in the community. Yeah.
Email us.
Kirstin and I, we might have to, we can get some stuff together if we don't already have some things. I know the Wolf Conservation Center probably also has some infographics and documents that we can either use or ask them to help draft up as well.
I like there's a really great conversation in the chat going on about, coyotes eating pets. Like, they will. There's us saying like, oh, people didn't claim their pets is not pretending that they're not going to eat cats and dogs, because they will. But yeah, it is important to reminder that that's everywhere, and it does come down to management. I mean, again, I have really little dogs, and I'm always like very concerned at night when I let them out my backyard. And so like we don't do that unless we're there with them and very close to them, So I mean, it's harder, but I think pet management. Which is part of, I don't know if I'm sure folks have maybe familiar with Ron Wooten's story, but that was his story. He let his dog off leash running around the dunes and wasn't with it, and it got killed by a pack of these animals, these ghost wolves. And he looked at them, and instead of being angry, he was like, well, I shouldn't have, that was he felt his responsibility for letting his dog out like that, and then was more intrigued and interested in why they looked different and how they sounded different and why were there so many in this pack. And it kind of initiated this whole story by a pet being killed and it leading to interest and not hatred. But that's probably a very unique person.
I misspelled scientist. Just ignore my misspellings in the chat. We want to put together some sort of sample kit and set of instructions and some guidelines for people who want to collect scat, send it into us. We're not ready yet, but also, I don't know, if you see a ghost wolf pooping and you want to collect it, do that. You can mail it to us, me. I'll take one for the team and hold on to the poo until Kirstin wants it. But I think at one point, hopefully in the next couple months, we can get together a nice just kit to mail out to anyone who really wants, or they can request it from our website. I think that's an easier way to then send out some supplies, or send out just, you need Ziploc bags, you'll maybe need some gloves, or you'll need a Sharpie.
Yeah,
Nice.
I think those conversations that we've had over the last month has really like makes me think we should to pull the trigger sooner than later to start galvanizing all of you amazing people that want to help and contribute, and that's one way to do it, particularly on the West End. I saw an email about West End. Go pick up poop down there. That's hopefully not dog.
Yeah, anything. So if anyone does also see a roadkill that's not a dog, most people, I think, submit that or call that into the animal control, but you know, people send me bits of roadkill carcass all the time, so don't hesitate to do that. I think there's, well, okay, maybe, I don't know. I think still contacting animal control is a really good, safe way. We've been working with them for several years. So any tissue type, even if it looks really gross and stinky, we still like it, especially if it's on the West End. If it's anywhere. Do we talk about the species concepts question there? If an animal is 69% a red wolf, do you call it a red wolf?
I mean, I don't know.
I call it a red wolf.
I think it's getting, yeah. That is the question.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
I see, so like people can provide gloves, bags, that's super awesome. Do you all have like a contact email list that if we get together, we can send it directly to one person that can disseminate this information, so we get instructions, and maybe Laura, like, who's able to, help provide bat kits and things like that, and we can just get it going.
Yeah, I'm up for that. Anyone who wants to compile a list, ask your neighbors, ask your friends.
Yeah, that would be great, Laura. If we have like a point of contact we could
Yeah.
send something to, and then use that to help disseminate broadly.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you've been in communication with Robin Novak mainly.
Trying to say,
Robin,
I'll be
could you
glad.
take the lead on that?
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. I'll get
Yeah.
you guys a list.
Yeah, we can have some really wonderful sample kits and info sheets and just anything shared with anyone who wants to do something.
Yeah, if you share it with me, I can get it to the group. That's not a problem whatsoever.
And this is David Novak, and I've collected my share of poo over the years.
So has anyone done?
Okay, guys, I want to thank you both. This was amazing. I mean, your town hall was good, but this was over the top. So thank
Aw.
you guys for both coming and sharing all this great research with us.
I'm going to repeat what I said in the town hall, much to the chagrin of probably other people, but if you have questions that we just couldn't get to today, I see one that I just don't have time right now to put in my full answer in the chat. Just email me a question. I'm happy to help get an answer to you. I have my email in the chat. Just send it. These are really great questions. So don't be shy.
And CC me, but Bridgett will probably respond faster.
I love email.
Slower. But I try really hard.
You do good, Kristen.
They're educated. In fact, they should be.
Thank you, everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Okay.
Super
All
fun.
right, thank you. Thank you again.
Yeah. This is Mike. Thank you so much for a terrific presentation. The GBAC members can post this as 1 point hour of superb AT. And we really appreciate your taking the time out to tell us about this fascinating subject.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay.
Have a good
Thank
night.
you. Night, everybody.
Bye.
Don't leave you.
If anybody wanted to hang around and chat, I'll go ahead and allow people to start their video and unmute if anybody wants to talk.
I can't hang out. I have to go. It's
Okay,
8:30
that's
here for
that's
Yeah. Did you get your kids fed already? I
Yeah.
hope.
Yeah, I missed bedtime, so I should probably go first thing.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
everybody.
Thanks for spreading the
night.
word.
Take care.